Okay, bienvenue. Welcome to Massey College and to this very special symposium that we're doing on media with the German Consulate General. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers. I'm the principal of Massey College, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you here, both our in-person audience and our audience online. We're very delighted to have this partnership with the German Consul General to explore with more depth issues that affect journalism and public policy throughout the world. And this marks the fourth year that we're doing this symposium, and I want to thank the German Consul General for continuing to support this event. I think it allows Massey College to celebrate its long-term partnership with Germany, but also its long-term investment in the quality of good journalism in Canada and elsewhere throughout the world as a sign of healthy democracies. I want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Yonwanda, Seneca, Haudenosaunee, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to acknowledge on all of our behalf our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to be here together to continue to do our work. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the Consul Général to address you, and so that we begin a good way this wonderful seminar. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Nathalie. Thank you. Hello and good morning, everybody, in person and online. Welcome to the fourth edition of our German Canadian Media Symposium. Once again, bringing German and Canadian journalists and experts together for discussion and networking. A very warm welcome to our distinguished German and Canadian panelists. Joining us in person is Dr. Jan-Jonathan Bock, who leads the Business Council for Democracy for the Hertie Foundation in Germany, an initiative that counters divisive disinformation through digital citizenship trainings in the workplace. I cannot wait to hear your insights and expertise. Joining us virtually are Mark Dugge, a public broadcasting journalist with on-the-ground reporting experience from Ukraine, joining us from Germany, and Sabine Muscat, a longtime journalist on both sides of the Atlantic and current head of technology and digital policy at the Washington office of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. Likewise, it is my pleasure to greet our in-person panelists, Michelle Shepard, Aaron Wendland, and Anatoly Kusht, and a very special hello and thank you to the 2022-23 William Southam Journalism Fellows at Massey College. Zuhal, Omera, Vanya, Hannah, Natasha, and Valerie for their participation and curiosity to learn about Germany. During our last symposium in October 2021, we covered one of the globally most monumental events in recent history, the COVID-19 pandemic and its societal impact. We had no idea that only a few months later, the world would be confronted with the largest war in Europe since the Second World War. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has killed tens of thousands of people, displaced millions from their homes, devastated entire cities in Ukraine, and disrupted global energy and food supplies. Let me say it quite clearly. This war is not only a blatant violation of international law, it also aims at destroying freedom and democracy in Europe. Just as in 2014, when Russia first invaded and then annexed Crimea and subsequently brought war to the Donbass region, this war is again accompanied by a host of propaganda and disinformation intended to spread the Russian narrative and influence public opinion around the world. How has propaganda evolved over that time? What have we learned over the last 8 years on recognizing and countering it? Disinformation and fake news are nothing new. In fact, our symposiums in 2019 and 2020 dealt with fake news, alternative facts, and untruths about various issues, and how journalism can respond to them in the digital age. Natalie and I have already noted that with these topics, the Media Symposium has always been up to date, and we will continue to tackle pressing issues related to freedom of speech, independent journalism, and the spreading of hate speech. Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Ressa, a recent guest at the Massey Press Club in October, has covered this issue at length with sobering results. In today's information age, news spread fast. And in most social media platforms, unfortunately, fake news and propaganda spread even faster than real news. By definition, it is difficult for verified fact-checked journalism to keep up with this unverified posts and statements that are just being disseminated without the constraints of journalistic rigor. Equally, as Sir Richard Evans recently explained in a lecture on the occasion of Holocaust Education Week, conspiracy theories have an allure that facilitates their spread precisely because they are unburdened by reality, facts, or logic. And AI-driven echo chambers amplify the spreading. Yet, even in such times of rampant disinformation, we have seen journalists responding to crisis and war with integrity and diligence, filtering through the streams of facts and fictions and providing their audiences with an accurate assessment. I am hence excited for the following panels and discussions, listening to the conversation of journalists, academics, and practitioners to understand how propaganda tries to shape narratives in new and old media and the role journalists play in responding to it. I encourage you here in the audience, but especially those of you joining us virtually, to engage in these discussions through questions in our chat and participation in our interactive polls and make this German-Canadian exchange even more meaningful. Maria Ressa made it crystal clear. If we do not manage to deal with fake news and disinformation properly, democracy is in danger. Therefore, I'm particularly happy to tackle these issues together with our Canadian friends and partners of Massey College. The more we face crises like the war in Ukraine, the more unreliable and unwilled authoritarian countries around the world prove themselves to be, the more important it is for like-minded countries like ours, for universities and media outlets to seek out alliances and support collaboration. That is the best way to forge meaningful long-term partnerships through research, personal connections, and common goals around shared values. And that's why I'm so happy to work together with Massey College and with you, Natalie. With this, I'm handing over the mic to our first moderator for today and current William Southern Journalism Fellow, Omera Issa. The floor is yours, Omera.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Consul General. Thank you, Principal Desrosiers. I hope my mic is on. It is certainly... We're just having some technical issues again. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here with you to this fourth German Canadian Media Symposium. Today's topic is, of course, timely and very important. How can journalism counter propaganda? I'm Omera Issa. I'm a senior reporter, national reporter with CBC News, particularly interested in how narratives shape democratic institutions. And of course, media is at the core of that. And in the light of this Russian aggression against Ukraine, the proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, journalism with the search of verifiable facts is fundamental. So how can journalists cover war and respond to propaganda to inform audiences? That is what is at the center of this first panel that I'm happy to be moderating with our esteemed guests. I also would like to let you know that there will be two other panels throughout the next couple of hours that we are together, particularly how to address the impacts of propaganda in diverse workspaces, and war propaganda and counter-propaganda in social media sphere. You will also be able to ask questions, particularly for the online audiences. Know that you can do that at any time throughout our convening. So for this first panel, our esteemed panelists, Zuhal Ahad. Zuhal is a journalist from Afghanistan who has worked as a multimedia women's affairs journalist with the BBC in Afghanistan. And after the changes in the country, Zuhal fled the country to Dubai and then to Toronto. She is currently working as a freelance journalist and has published for The Guardian and Al Jazeera. We also have with us Michelle Shepard. Michelle Shepard is an award-winning journalist and author, a filmmaker, a podcast host, a producer who has covered issues of terrorism and civil rights since the 9/11 attacks. And Michelle has covered many war-torn countries, including Yemen. Mark Duger is joining us from Germany. He is with, and I have written how to pronounce this, Hessische Rundfunk, voila, in Frankfurt. Thank you, Mark. I see you. And working in many capacities, including as ARD crisis correspondent in Ukraine. So without further ado, we will get into the questions. We don't have a lot of time. Mark, I'd like to start with you because you were in Ukraine not too long ago. You're planning on going back underground this week. So you are very much at the heart of this conversation. When reporting from a war zone, how do you deal with propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and questionable reports?
Well, of course, you always want to see what's happening, and you cannot, and this is the bad part, verify everything personally in person, especially at the front line. So you're obliged to double check with locals, with other reporters on the ground, if there are any. You can also ask your back office to verify some tweets, for example. We have special teams who are able to track pictures, for example, to estimate the probability of a certain event, which is in the social media. And but of course, you always try to get there. For example, you get the news that a supposedly civilian target has been hit. This is often difficult to verify. The area is restricted in many cases. You can try to figure out, to talk to the people who know the area, but you can't always expect to get the truth. They might have an interest as well to not reveal the truth. So in the end, you have to have your trusted sources, which can be local journalists, for example. You have to have your network. You have to have a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of knowledge about the culture, for example, where you are, and nonetheless also trust your gut feeling.
And Michelle, you have also been in war-affected areas in the world. How do you deal with that challenge when you are on the ground?
It's really difficult. And just to be clear, I haven't covered the war in Ukraine. I think this is one of the most difficult ones to cover in terms of the propaganda that's been coming out on both sides, really, and the difficulty with verifying it. It is impossible to cover it without being there. And it's a challenging time in media now because I think we have less coverage than we've ever had before, foreign coverage, just because of the way the industry is going. But, in the past, some of the countries where I did cover conflicts in Somalia, you mentioned Yemen, Pakistan, those were some of the trickiest countries to sort of verify facts. And I'm going to repeat a bit of what Mark said, but obviously being there, what you can verify in person is the most important, as many sources as you can. And I kind of got to a point where I think I was very cynical probably in a good way, journalism-wise, just to sort of assume everybody has an agenda. And the more power that they have, probably the greater agenda there is. So probably somebody you're meeting on the street, the civilian, the victim that you're talking with, the survivor, they're going to, I would presume, be the most truthful. And then you go all the way up to the government and there's a message. So you just push back as hard as you can. I think a lot of times when you're starting out in journalism, you often have, the impression that those in positions of power are going to be obviously telling the truth. And so often, governments are adept at propaganda better than anybody. And we don't have to look to foreign conflicts. For many years, I covered, the quote unquote war on terror, and spent, many, many trips down to Guantanamo Bay. And in terms of what the Pentagon would put out and what you would see on the ground and the kind of way the message would be manipulated, it was really important to have experience to push back and, again, to just be as cynical as you can be. Yeah.
Which is so important in this profession, right? Zuhal, you are from Afghanistan. You are a reporter from Afghanistan. How important is it to verify facts and disprove questionable reports?
Well, Afghanistan is a complex society, and it has been in war for more than decades now, and still it's in war, but in a different shape. So I think it's very important to always keep in mind that we stay in a distance from every source, like we don't, we embrace the complexities and we stay away from all the sources. It doesn't mean that, like, we always, as Michelle said, we always have this, sometimes we have this mindset that the propaganda comes from Taliban or from the Afghan government, but also we should keep in mind that it can come from greater powers, and we should always have this in mind that we might be biased to some sources, like we should check with every sources, not the sources we feel close to. So that is what happens sometimes when we look for fast news, and that brings us unhealthy news because we don't have the enough time to check and cross-check it with everyone and have the local voices, which is very important. And I see that this having local voices, having local journalists is something we lack in international media. And I think even now it's not late to start and have local journalists as our partners in the story and have as a byline, not as a fixer or as a translator. So it's very important to have someone to give us the context and to give us the sources that are really reliable and can tell us the facts. So, yeah.
And we've certainly seen with this war in Ukraine, the onslaught of propaganda. Is it even possible to keep up, Michelle?
You have to. I mean, good question. I mean, I think it's really, really difficult, especially since, as Mark said, checking that which goes out on social media and often spreads the fastest. And it's really, really difficult to do that. But I thought another really interesting point is one that you used about how you try and stay completely objective and not sort of align with one side. That's really difficult to do in war sometimes. I can't even imagine it from your perspective in terms of, trying to take the Taliban at face value when, the Taliban is also targeting journalists. Not to compare it at all, but had a tiny experience with that and covering the Arab Spring in Yemen. And, the government forces were shooting at the protesters, but they were also shooting at us. So it's really difficult then to step away when these government forces are trying to kill you and report objectively on what they're saying. That makes it really, really difficult. I don't have an answer, just I think it's important to keep in mind because, as you say, the propaganda doesn't always come from the sources that you think. Sometimes the Taliban could be telling the truth, and that must be a really hard thing to report when that's a group that's targeting you.
Mm. Mark, let me ask you the same question about the onslaught of propaganda. Is it even possible to keep up? You will be around very, very soon, in a matter of a few days. How do you keep up on the ground?
Well, you have to have good producers to start with in the field who are able to translate the reality on the ground to you, who is not always there. I mean, who can help you interpret actions and facts. And you always have to keep in mind that your producers might have an agenda too. You just have to keep it in mind. It might not be this way, but you have to be really careful with every information that you get, because in the end, I mean, this is really a challenge, I think, in this conflict, that we we have our sympathies. I think most of the journalists have the sympathies with the Ukrainian side, right? Because there's a country who's been attacked, but of course the Ukrainians have their interest as well to sell you a version of the events. So just to keep that in mind, that when you go there, be skeptical with everything you hear, and have trust. You have to trust your sources and your colleagues there. You have to have a good network, and this is key, I think.
So, Hal, I think this taps into what you were saying earlier. Well, how do people keep up when they are on the ground and fighting against misinformation as they're reporting in real time?
Well, nowadays for Afghanistan, it's a very hard times, and it's very difficult to answer this question, but that is our job, and we have to do it and make sure we cross-check the facts we get, the information we get, and make sure the information we get is accurate. And that would be possible to when we check it with locals. So I want to insist again that locals are a very good source of fact checking. So we can get as sources as we can and check with them. For instance, a while ago we did a report on women who had been pushed away from job and they were not allowed to go back to job. We talked to some of them, and when we talked to the Taliban, they were like, no, we haven't told anyone. They are scared. They cannot come. So it's a very difficult time, because if you don't have the sources in Afghanistan, in the country, how would you check it? Like, who would you rely? So that's when I say that the best source can be the locals, and we should make sure we check with them.
So, Michelle, Zohal is talking about connection with the local populations on the ground. We are storytellers, we are journalists, which means we tell people stories. Is it a good way to actually counter propaganda?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as Zohal had mentioned, that there just hasn't been enough emphasis on local reporting. And in the past, there was sort of this model with foreign correspondents working alongside, often in the role of fixers, sometimes as a journalist if the local reporter would want a byline. But I think we're starting to see those partnerships grow, especially, as I said, because fewer and fewer journalists are foreign journalists are going into the field. So it's vital, of course. It's also difficult, however, for local journalists to report, because this sort of gross benefit of being a foreign correspondent who doesn't live in the country is that you can go in and out, but you always have to be so careful of the journalists who live there and are going to face the consequences of their reporting. So that has to be something that's always taken into consideration. And large media outlets that are, employing local journalists obviously have to be mindful of that. And I just wanted to add one thing to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how we fact check and how we try and make sure to counter the propaganda. I think in these discussions, we rightfully talk mainly about the journalists who are on the ground, but this is also a responsibility of the news writ large and editors. And I think in today's day, there's such competition to get out there first and keep the 24 news cycle going, which I understand. But at the same time, when we make a mistake or if we spread propaganda, the impact these days, I mean, it's always been high, but it's really, really critical now. So for, the quote, legacy media that's supposed to get it right to counter this, notion of fake news, I think there needs to be a sense from management not to push journalists to get out there quickly, that they have to be part of the process, knowing that everything is triple checked, quadruple checked before you go out. There's a lot of stress when you're on the front line, and if your competition has something that you don't have, right, and you're hearing it from that feeling. Yeah. So I think it's got to be you got to be in partnership there.
Yeah. Mark, let me get to you on this, particularly this question of how to combat propaganda by being more relatable, by telling people stories. Couching to that question is a question around how is it to report on the ground in Ukraine actually? Give us a little bit of an understanding of the challenges you face and opportunities, of course.
Well, reporting in Ukraine, I mean, there are a lot of like challenges, like basic challenges these days, like do you have electricity? Do you have internet? Because there are outages these days. But this is more of the infrastructure question. Of course, you always have to plan where you want to go, and you have to make careful considerations of what you can um, of what you can really do with a good conscience. How far can you go to the front line? How do you get out if things are getting ugly there and dangerous for you? How do you organize what are your exit strategies, for example? These are also questions that we have to keep in mind, and we have some security advisors with us who help us in evaluating these situations. And then, of course, you want to get around in the country. You want to talk to as many people as possible, and to have impressions as possible. But we have so many news to cover. I mean, there's also such a heavy workload that sometimes we feel like forced to stay in Kiev just to cover it, and we have to organize ourselves to really have the freedom to move around and to get the real reporting. So what we did in ARD is, for example, we have a staff who is helping us from Cologne with the basic news. They are checking the everyday events, like the basic news stuff. And we are more there for live talks, for reporting, talk to the people, getting impression from the ground. So, because otherwise it's getting just impossible. ARD has about, for example, 60 radio programs, different TV channels, and so the workload is just too crazy. And we want to move, and we want to have the opportunity to talk to people. So it's also a question of organizing yourself.
We only have 5 minutes left. So my last question for on this important topic is around public interest. As we look at the next few months, perhaps, of this, how do we keep the public's attention on this important situation? So how you mentioned from the outset that you are from a country that has been in an ongoing war for decades. How do you keep people's attention going, particularly when the situation is high stake like this one?
Yeah, exactly. So now it's a very difficult time for everyone. Like the world deals with such a complex issues. Like there's so much going on and to report on, like Afghanistan, Ukraine, the world, everything is so hard. And it's difficult to answer this, but what we can do is to keep writing about it. And nowadays we have social media, which is also a very powerful medium. Like we can't rely only on mainstream media because there's a lot, but also there is social media which you can use and spread information about what's going on, and also as much as reporting you can do. Yeah.
It's such a tough question. I mean, I think we've stopped talking about Afghanistan. You know, on CBC, the top story was the famine in Somalia.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about Yemen anymore. There's so many crises that are happening. And I always feel the public can only usually handle one at a time, and there just becomes this sort of compassion fatigue, unfortunately. I think the only way really to counter it is, as Zuhal said, you just doing it. And you just have to find ways best you can to really relate the war. Just people only care about what they kind of can relate to. It just makes sense. It's human nature. So if you can tell the stories not in terms of numbers, not in terms of, sort of military battles, but in terms of the people affected. And sometimes this is why, good journalism really has an impact. You have that, everyone remembers that one picture in Ukraine of the family fleeing. And that was a Lindsay Addario picture. And she went back and made sure she, identified who they were and then told their story. That's the way I think you just have to keep it top of the news. And again, that means being there and, people like Mark getting there and finding out what they can.
Thank you, Michelle. Mark?
I totally agree. I think this is our job, right? I mean, we have to find out why it should interest our audience, how people can relate to these topics, is in their lives. I mean, in Germany, the answer is a clear yes, because we have the high energy prices, where our military is a factor there. Lots of people know Ukraine because they have been there. We can relate to the way of living. We have lots of refugees right now in Germany, so there's a kind of a linkage. But this is why it's so complex to sustain an interest in a war in Ethiopia or Yemen. Much more difficult in Ukraine. I agree. I mean, there's limited resources. Maybe just one big conflict makes it into news. So I think we have to find a hook. We have to make it relevant, why people should be interested, and challenge for us.
Thank you very much for this very, very important dialogue and conversation. What I'm hearing from the three of you is that the tenets of journalism are even more important and fundamental in this moment. So now we will go to the audience questions. People in the virtual world can certainly ask questions, and we will make sure to ask them, as well as people in the audience. Yes. Oh, there's a mic that will be passed on.
How important is it that so much of the on-the-ground journalism in Ukraine and in the Middle East, as examples, is coming from stringers and unaffiliated journalists who operate independently and being part of a long and continuous organization such as the CBC or the major newspapers that used to have correspondents in every corner of the world? It seems to me that the potential for bias, the potential for distortion is greater when your news is coming, a mixed bag of people about whom, as a reader, I know very little or nothing. I'd like to hear your comments.
Thank you.
I can start. I mean, it's really a double-edged sword. On one hand, I celebrate the fact that we have more citizen journalism than we've ever had before. And what about earlier, the need for local reporting has never been greater. On the other hand, you raise a good point, which is that how do you verify what's coming from independent journalists? Presumably, New York Times, the Toronto Star, the CBC, we have these checks and balances, and you have accountability if it's wrong. That's not really answering your question. It's just that I agree that it's tough to know where the news is coming from. We're also seeing this model that you have more independent or freelance journalists working for the large organizations or the medium-sized organizations that aren't sending their own foreign correspondents. It's just cheaper to do it that way, which I understand, but I always worry too in those instances that I feel that the media outlets have the same responsibility that they should have to those correspondents, that their own correspondents. So those correspondents should be trained in security. If that correspondent gets kidnapped, that media outlets has to make sure they get them home. And I think responsible media outlets know that and do that. But I do worry when I see really sort of young and experienced journalists in the field working for big outlets and just hoping they have all the security and protections that they need.
Online question.
We have a question from Jeffrey Dworkin, author of the book Trusting the News in a Digital Age. What is the obligation of the public to verify the news? Or is this something that established news organizations should be required to provide on behalf of news consumers?
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Perhaps I will actually give that question to Mark.
Yeah, I think media competence is more important than ever, and I think lots of schools, for example, teach that how to carefully scan the news, how to find out which sources are to be trusted, where you have to be skeptical. So in a time where we have less and less correspondence, as Michelle said, I think it's more and more important to be able to evaluate the trustworthiness of the news that you're getting. And so in the end of the day, I think major news organizations are more important than ever because they have the resources to do that on the public, but everybody has to has its own responsibility and is responsible to check it themselves.
Thank you. A question from the floor now. Yes, sir.
My question is how relevant propaganda has been in the last 100 years in the final outcome of any event. We see it never worked, maybe sell the narrative in the short run, but in the long run it has never paid off. In fact, this question of how to differentiate propaganda from news came 50 years ago in the next room. Last room, 50 years ago, Linda Frum was here, and I asked her this question. I'm going to ask you again. Most of the times, people who are reporting do not know the local language. And I think most of the mainstream media is sampling very small and shrinking English-speaking world in intelligence. How representative that is for the real news?
So could you repeat your question, please?
I mean, how
it is.
First of all, how relevant is propaganda to the final event?
Uh-huh.
I don't think in the last 100 years really paid off. And secondly, how representative is your thing on the reality when most of the people do not know the language? May I ask how many of you reporting on Ukraine or Russian know Ukrainian or Russian language? That's very relevant, I think.
I couldn't get the full question. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the question is around the linguistic challenges of people reporting underground and not necessarily knowing the language of the ground when they are in foreign places where they are correspondents.
So yeah, we get back to local journalists and who are very familiar with the language, with the culture, with the context, with the history of the country. The events are always relevant to the history and all of these elements. And I think having the local journalists is very vital for us to have the fact and the real news. So I hope that answers your question.
It's a good question. Of course, I think as foreign correspondents, you have to always know that you're coming in with your own lens. And part of that lens is that you might not know the language, you might not know the culture, and you have to be very aware of that and not make assumptions. I think sort of the perfect partnership is having the partnership, that if you can build those partnerships between local journalists and foreign journalists coming in, because so many of the issues too, while they impact locally, the decisions get made in Washington and London and Ottawa. And so it's good to have that knowledge. One example, I remember covering the drone, the issue of drone warfare. There would be journalists that would just cover it from Washington at the larger organizations and journalists that would just cover it from Yemen. And they were just such distinct positions that I felt lucky that I was at a medium-sized organization that couldn't afford to have both places. So I got to go both places. And to me, that really made it I was able to get the full story with local journalists, because what's being said in Washington about the success of a drone isn't the same when you go there and you realize it's hit actually a wedding party, not Al-Qaeda. So, I think if you could get those partnerships, but it's an absolutely a valid point that of course you miss a lot if you don't know the language and you don't know the culture. And it would be arrogant going into a country and not remembering that in your coverage.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think, Mark, you were also mentioning that. So we will now go to an online question.
Question from Neil Seaman. To what extent can you secure funding or time to access alternative real-time data, e.g. Bellingcat, Storyful, to ground truth or test hypotheses in conflict states?
Thank you very much. Perhaps, Mark, I'll go to you for that question.
It's a specific question which would be one of our fact checkers could answer much better than I do. I know that there are lots of technical possibilities, but I have to admit I'm not that deep into the topics that I would be able to give a sufficient answer. But of course, we consult Bellingcat and other resources as well that I don't know.
It's certainly not my specialty too, except to know that Bellingcat does incredible work and keep a close eye on them. And when you get those partnerships, it's incredible. I mean, Citizen Lab here in Toronto, U of T does that as well, and they do some incredible partnerships. So I think we're going to see more and more, because there's very few journalists who actually have nowhere near the skills of some of these other organizations that do.
Thank you very much. Thank you so very much, everybody, for being here with us. This concludes our very first panel on this important topic. Thank you to our panelists for reminding us of the importance of journalism. Thank you for convening us. And now we will take a little break before passing to the second panel.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone who is here in person and those that are listening to us online. We are very glad to be here, and we're just right on time for our second panel of this discussion. This discussion, as you're aware, is very timely and really essential because, like we have heard from our Speaker, the Consul General, democracy is under threat. We need to address this concern and do it now. So, well, my name is Wan Jagadu. I'm a journalist from Kenya. And I am the Gordon Fisher Fellow for the Massey Fellowship 2022-2023. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jan Bock, an expert from Germany, who is going to be speaking to us about how to combat propaganda in the workplace. Now, allow me to give you a brief about who Jonathan Bock is. He's an expert in democratic life, trust in the state, and social transformations. He holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge and has led interdisciplinary research projects into populist politics and pluralist societies. Jan has published on citizenship, diversity, and crisis experiences across Europe, the Gulf region, and India. He is currently leading the Business for Democracy for the Hari Foundation in Germany, an initiative that counters divisive information through digital citizenship and training in the workplaces. So, Jan, please join us. Thank you. The stage is yours.
Bonjour. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you everyone for being here and for joining us online. I'm just checking the presentation is, I can't yet see my presentation, so I'm still waiting for the presentation. There we go. Let's check if this works. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you especially to Massey College for hosting this event, and to Thomas Schulze and the Consulate General for making this possible. It's great to be in Canada. It's my first time in Canada, and I'm delighted to be here and to be here with you all. I think I'm taking this conversation in a slightly different direction. I want to give a more hands-on approach of how we might counter disinformation, especially reach people who are outside the formal education institutions such as schools and universities. I guess in a way I'm responding to a question that came up in the previous session, is what responsibility do members of the public have to verify the news and verify the sources? So first of all, I want to talk a bit about what's happening in places, what's happening in society, and this might be a more German perspective. So I will be very interested in hearing more about what's happening in Canada, maybe later in the discussion. So workplaces in Germany are becoming more diverse and they're becoming more remote. German society is changing, and this is of course reflected in the workplace as well. And not just over the past couple, but even before, people have started working more remotely as well. I think this brings certain challenges with it because we lack spaces of encounter, of interacting with difference and managing differences in a productive and constructive way. And I think the workplace is a very important opportunity for this, and we have to make sure that we don't lose it. Also, young people are much more engagement from their employer. We talk about CSR, corporate social responsibility, ESG, and so on, and there is a push, especially from younger people, millennials and Generation Z, to demand more from the employer, to take a stand, to have values and to express these values as well. And I will later on say that these values are also values that have to do with democracy and democracy and giving people a better education regarding digital citizenship, especially. For many young people, work-life balance, sorry, there's a word missing, but it's meant to be work-life balance, is more important. And I think this is also relevant for the way in which we approach work. And at the same time, as work-life balance is becoming more important, what we're seeing in Germany is that this old idea that the business of business is business and politics shouldn't be discussed in the workplace is no longer as clear-cut as it used to be. Over the last couple of years, and this goes to the second column now, many of the big social transformations and political challenges have appeared in the workplace, and it's no longer feasible to expect people to leave their political ideas, political opinions outside the workplace. In Germany, this was especially pertinent, of course, with the refugee crisis of 2015-16. This was a time when over 1 million refugees arrived in Germany in the space of just over a year. And this was discussed up and down the country, what it means for work, what it means for people, especially who are in precarious employment when they could be easily replaced by cheaper labor force coming from refugees. Of course, the pandemic, who wears a mask, who doesn't wear a mask, who's vaccinated, who isn't vaccinated. These questions were discussed up and down the workplace, and they were highly divisive and continue to be divisive. And some groups were excluded from being able to go to work because they were to be vaccinated. And now, of course, the situation in Russia and Ukraine is also entering the workplace. Germany has a large Russian population or Russian-born population, but also many Ukrainians in the country. And many companies are struggling to accommodate these differences and the very different kinds of information, or you might say propaganda, coming from one side or the other side, and influence and engage with one another in the workplace. Now, as a result of these many crises over the last couple of years, we do notice that there is less trust in the state, in Germany as well, because it suffered enormously under the pressures over the past years. The economic model, is this economic still working for us? And of course, the media. And that's where I want to talk about the ways in which the workplace and democracy can actually come together. And I want to talk about the way in which the workplace is also a democracy lab, right? We encounter social diversity and we practice tolerance in the workplace more than in other places. These economic and social change challenges that I just mentioned, they are being discussed by people in the workplace. It's the space where we spend a lot of time, 8 hours or more a day. Apart from sleeping, apart from our bed, it's probably the only place where we spend as much time. And we need to deal with difference. Our workplaces in Germany are becoming more diverse, and we need to be able to find constructive ways of engaging with difference and with challenges that result from war propaganda in the Russia-Ukraine war, that result from the pandemic and the ways in which some people experience the pandemic very differently and read science and scientific assessment of the pandemic very differently. So I believe that workplaces, since they remain spaces of engagement and exchange across differences, are very important for democratic culture. Because as I don't know about the situation in Canada, but as in Germany, many other places of engagement are shrinking. Clubs and societies, the churches, sports clubs, trade unions. We need to make sure that we maintain societal spaces where we come in contact with people who are unlike ourselves, whether it's culturally diverse, ethnically diverse, different educational biographies, people who come from different regions of the country and so on, to make sure that we can maintain social cohesion. And this idea that work is just work and we don't want to talk about politics or society or values, I don't think that holds any longer, because for any democracy to miss this opportunity of using the workplace much more constructively to talk about the differences and to talk about the ways in which we consume media, in which we interpret the world around us, that will be a huge loss to any democratic culture. I'm therefore quite skeptical with regard to this remote working trend that is becoming more pronounced in Germany as well as elsewhere. Germany is to a sense immune to it in certain areas because there is still heavy industry, and people who go to Volkswagen or to Mercedes, they have to be in the factory to assemble cars. But as Elon Musk is now showing us in the new Tesla factory that is built or is being built south of Berlin, you need increasingly fewer people to assemble even cars and more remotely. And I think that leads to an estrangement from one another in society. What we do in this initiative that I lead, the Business Council for Democracy, is we talk to companies about ways in which they can more productively bring people together and talk about democracy and democratic culture, because we feel that many companies are also suffering the digital threats that are disruptive to democracy, especially disinformation, hate speech, or conspiracy myths. Many companies over the past years have been exposed to attacks and to disruptive disinformation, and they want to know how to respond to this. They want to know what to do when in the internet people are suddenly spreading hate speech or disinformation. And the company doesn't know whether they should moderate that conversation that happens in the intranet, and they will be accused of censorship, especially pertinent in East German companies as well, or they should just, let people say what they want to say, but that creates a space in which disinformation and hate speech can be spread, and a number of people will start to disengage from the kind of conversations we have about democracy and the functioning of our democracy and communication are also affecting companies. And that's why I want to tell you a bit about this initiative that I've been leading for 18 months now. It's called the Business Council for Democracy, and it's an attempt to empower people, empower employees in the workplace to be better digital citizens. 3 project partners in this: the Hertie Foundation, for which I work, and the Robert Bosch Foundation, which are 2 of Germany's largest philanthropic organizations. And both foundations have for a long time now worked in the space of social cohesion and strengthening democracy. And the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a 3rd partner, is a think and do tank that was established in the kingdom after 9/11 to understand extremism and polarization better, and now has an office in Germany as well. So what do we do this project? Because we feel that there are 3 main things that make it difficult for people to engage constructively with one another in the digital space. It's hate speech online, it's conspiracy myths, and it's mis or disinformation that threaten democratic life overall, and also social cohesion in a more diverse Germany. And they're threatening this in the public, but also in the workplace. We feel that there are very few training and lifelong learning opportunities for people of a certain age. We earlier talked about schools, and it's very important to teach media skills and media competence in schools. But what do you do with people who are, and I know this is terrain, but 40 plus, and who might not have grown up with the digital age being part of their youth and adolescence, and they're very much exposed to social media. They are very active on Facebook, and Germany is a country that has a large population of boomers, people in their late 50s, early 60s, who did not necessarily grow up with this kind of digital democratic culture. They're very much exposed to propaganda. We know from research that they tend to be more gullible. They find it harder to distinguish false from true facts, and they don't know how to navigate the digital space and digital media quite as effectively as younger people. So they are often affected by digital harms, but they don't know what to do and how to respond. So how do we reach these people? And we think that increasingly civil and the private sector need to support the state. We can't just rely on the state to fix this problem, to go into schools and put on better curricula. We all need to work together. And companies are affected by disinformation. If trust erodes, trust in people and people's products also erodes, and that affects companies and their economic success as well. So what do? We offer training programs at work. The question early on was, how can we rely on members of the public to? Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. How can we empower members of the public to verify the news themselves? Well, this is how we do it. We teach employees what it means to be citizens. And we have 8-week-long training sessions, small groups of 20 to 25 employees that take place in the workplace. They're digital seminars or webinars, which take place, say, every Monday from 3 to 4 p.m. in the workplace. You turn on your laptop, you switch on your computer, and we tell you what hate speech is and how hate speech, or when hate speech, something you can report to the authorities, to the police, or to what extent difficult conversations are covered by free speech laws. We talk about conspiracy myths. We explain what they are, why they often have such strong anti-Semitic components, and how you talk to someone who spreads conspiracy myths in the workplace or at home. If someone comes home and says, you know what, Angela Merkel is a lizard, I know it because I saw it online, and there's a picture of her turning into a lizard at night, and this is it, then I want people to know, well, what do I say to someone who spreads this kind of, and you're laughing, but that is a very common conspiracy myth in certain circles of right-wing German populist East German crowds. How do you respond to that without saying, you're just totally crazy, man, I have nothing to say? That's not a very constructive way of engaging with someone who believes that Angela Merkel is really a lizard. And what do you do when you encounter mis or disinformation? How do you detect it, and how can you conduct a fact-checking? So what we do show is really practical responses as well. How do you do a fact-checking? How do you do a reverse image search? One example from our courses shows the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel in a circle with other members of a political party, the CDU, and they're all having a good laugh, and they're drinking champagne, and they're all ha 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 ha, and no one's wearing a mask. And the caption is something like, look at these people, you know, one rule for them, and we all have to wear masks. This is all bullshit, something like that. And you can now do image search, where you can search this image online, and then you find out that the image predates the pandemic by many, many years. Now, this sounds really basic, but if you're someone of a certain political persuasion and you're already frustrated and sad and angry at the state of the world, then this can make you even more angry, more frustrated. And we want to empower people who encounter this person to know how to check, how to do a reverse image search, and then say, hey, you've been sending this around the Telegram group in our company. That's actually wrong. I did a fact check, and this image is from 2017 or 2016. Please stop spreading this. So it's about empowering people who encounter mis and disinformation, who encounters conspiracy, mis and hate speech, to know what to do about it. Because most people instinctively know it's wrong, and I don't want this to happen, but they don't know how to respond without becoming a victim of hate speech themselves. So this is very important. It's about empowering citizens in the workplace to engage more productively with divisive digital content, to reflect their opinions, and to do counter speech in an effective way that shows that there is a solid majority that knows how to evaluate information and to push back against those that are creating divisive content. The costs of this are covered by the Hertie and Bosch Foundations for the companies. We're currently running it as a free offer for companies in Germany as well, to get this conversation going about how companies can strengthen democracy in the workplace. And with this, we also create a business network for democracy. Regularly, we bring these companies together that work with us and say, what else could you do to do more to strengthen democratic life, and especially digital citizenship practices? We often connect, HR, communications, and DEI departments. They are the ones who work most closely with us. And we also connect them with stakeholders from the government, from the media, journalists as well, who say, hey, I do really good journalism, but nobody reads it because there's so much disinformation. It's just flooding the place with noise. And if people don't know how to distinguish what's happening and what's true and what's not, then the best journalism is not going to be very effective. So we need to work with media and with science and civil society as well in this project. We also do lots of open access, and we have recently awarded a prize for the best TV documentary that engages with disinformation, for example. So we really want to create a close-knit community of people, of companies who want to stand up for democracy and see the workplace as a democracy lab where we can teach digital citizenship practices and use the space that is diverse, that is plural, is tolerant in order to engage with threats to democracy. So we regularly bring people together in these events. At the bottom left, for example, this was in Dresden in East Germany, which is a region that is really struggling with attracting talent. People do not want to move to to East Germany, because they're struggling with xenophobia, far-right sentiment, support for the AfD party, and companies are struggling because they can't fill vacancies. So they're really interested in being more outspoken about the support for democracy and the values they hold and espouse. This is some of the companies that are part of this network now. We started a year and a half ago with 6, now with over 60, and I'm going to finish with a call to action. If you are a German company, if you work for a German company, you know a German company, you think we can do more to support democratic life and democratic practices, please get in touch with us. You can follow us on LinkedIn and also on our website, bc4d.org. And I guess you stood up to signal to me that I have to wrap up. And I'm very happy to tell you that this is my last slide. So thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. And we are going to be having a conversation with Jan and I, and I will invite audiences online and here to ask questions after this. Tune in. Thank you. So Jan, really, thank you very much for that conversation. And you seem to have done a lot of work to counter propaganda in the workspaces. But I'm curious about how does a diverse workspace look like in Germany?
Gosh, I mean, that's a very broad question. It depends on where you are, really. I think Germany, unlike Canada or your southern neighbor, the United States, was not a multi-ethnic society to begin with. It was a much more homogeneous society. Germany has had immigration really since the 8th, 9th century and industrialization, but significantly since the 1950s and 1960s. But for many decades, people who migrated to Germany were excluded from citizenship, from participation, from being part of the political community. But Germany always had very strong integration in the workplace. And that's one of the strengths of the German model. Unlike Britain or France, people were always given economic opportunities to work and to be part of the economic community, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to migrate to the country. Now we're talking about the second or third generations, and they are demanding much more participation, much more visibility. And I think German workplaces are reflecting this as well. Younger generations are much more attuned to LGBTQI issues, to refugees. I talked about the 1 million Syrians that have been absorbed to a large extent by German businesses. Yeah. But now, of course, Ukrainian. After Poland, Germany is the country that has the largest group of Ukrainian refugees. And they are able to access the labor market from day one. It's different from other refugees because of the legal status, which is slightly different. Yeah. And I think reflected in German workspaces as well. And German companies need to do more to recruit, because in the next couple of years, the boomers are retiring and the younger generations are much more diverse. And Germany has a huge shortage of labor. Just to give you an idea, we estimate that we need 500,000 people, net migrants per year, 500,000, 500,000 people to maintain the German welfare state and the German welfare system. So that's a huge challenge to attract that many people, because Germans can be a bit cold and not the warmest towards strangers or newcomers to the country. And the language is a bummer, and it's very hard for people to learn it and to learn it well. But Germany needs to be more welcoming and to bring people into the country. And that's why many companies now are working pro-diversity, pro-democracy, and pro-social cohesion, because they realize that in order to prosper, they need to be more upfront about these values as well.
Well, thank you very much. You talk a lot about hate speech and xenophobia. And can you at least elaborate a little bit at what is hate speech and what is it doing to these diverse workspaces you're trying to create?
Yeah, I mean, hate speech is, it's a US term. The German would be Hassrede, but it's a literal translation of it. In Germany, it has a slightly different manifestation, because there are many things that you're not allowed to say under German law that would be allowed to say under different jurisdictions, like the United States. I don't know about Canada and Britain, for example. There's also more free speech culture than there is in Germany, especially with anti-Semitism, denying the Holocaust and so on. Hate speech generally is speech that denigrates, discriminates against people on the basis of characteristics such as their gender, the color of their skin, their ethnic background, or certain physical characteristics. They might be small, they might be tall, they might have red hair, and so on. So hate speech itself is not something that's covered in the penal code. It is not a legal term. But there are many areas of insults or defamation that fall under hate speech. And we study in these courses when people can what they find is upsetting or insulting. Initiatives that help people to report hate speech, and these initiatives can then check for you whether or not this is something that can require legal action, and they can report to the police as well.
Right. I'll speak a little bit about the xenophobia and how to combat it in the workspaces.
I do really believe that the best way of confronting stereotypes is just engaging with people. And, Germany is becoming more diverse in terms of ethnic, national, cultural, religious backgrounds. And stereotypes are very easy to play around in social media and so on. What we know is the contact hypothesis that the more contact you have with people, the more tolerant you are likely to be. And at the Wolf Institute in Cambridge, where I worked before I went back to Germany, we did a study that showed that there is a correlation between increasing remote working and a reduction in tolerance for other religious identities, religious groups, and religious practices. And it's much, much more difficult to characterize someone as, this bad ex-religion type if you have daily contact with these people and say, yeah, but they're really good fathers, or they love bowling, or, they love watching 1960s Italian realist cinema. And we have so much in common that doesn't come across when all you do is engage with stereotypes and have some Microsoft Teams conversations about your agenda and to-do list every day. And the workplace is a really, really important resource for democracies and for the most democracies. For me? Do we need to repeat everything I've said so far?
Go ahead. No, we can hear you.
It's a very important resource for more diverse democracies to learn to learn tolerance, to just get on with one another, really.
Now, what can the world learn from what your organization is doing and what Germany has done to promote cohesion? Because we realize that almost everywhere you look, there is conflict, there's crisis, and people are generally not together anymore. What can we learn? 3 things.
3 things. I guess one is one I just mentioned, that the workplace is a really important resource to bring people together and work with businesses, work with companies, because they also really want to make sure that there is harmony in the workplace. Because there is no harmony in the workplace, people are going to be less productive. So, and I know many civil society initiatives in Germany as well as elsewhere, often a bit cautious about the private sector. Don't want to work with the private sector. Sometimes it has to do with politics or ideology. And I would really encourage people to look beyond that and be more open-minded and approach businesses, because many businesses are approaching this topic more constructively than they might have done in the past. I think that's very important. That can probably be taken away for other contexts too. I think we need to be more innovative in how we think about social cohesion. And, Yasha Munk just published a book on this. Diverse democracies operate differently from more homogeneous, ethnically homogeneous democracies in the past. That's not necessarily a question that Canadians or US Americans have to ask themselves, but people in Denmark or Sweden or Germany or Poland. And that's a question that we really need to engage with much more productively, of how we can create social cohesion in diverse societies.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. Unfortunately, we don't have much time. I would have liked to ask you more prodding questions, but we invite the audience and people in the room to ask their questions. At the back, thank you.
Typically, corporations were.
I think you need to wait for a microphone, right? Oh, I have the microphone. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, typically, corporations were, concentrating on efficiency, productivity, and the values were functions of family, schools, and church. Now, and I know it's different there, so this is family versus purpose, everything high. Do you think corporations, the business, is the right place to talk about the values which are more than this family versus church and
yeah, good point. I will probably question the premise of your question, because I don't think corporations used traditionally to be just about business and money. I mean, I come from a country, and I lived in Italy for many years, where family companies, businesses have often merged the idea of the family and the family structure and inheritance with economic success. Also, after the Second World War, Germany established what is called the soziale Marktwirtschaft, the social market economy, where economic success for corporations or companies always went hand in hand with redistribution, with social housing that was built by companies for their workers, not simply state. So there is a long and an ongoing tradition, and you have this I think in this continent, on this continent as well, that companies have taken an interest in schools, in making sure that people are educated well, in social cohesion. The Fuggers in Augsburg in the 16th century built a community for workers who weren't able to afford housing otherwise. They realized that the entrepreneur, the marketeer, had a social responsibility that derived from a Christian logic at the same time as from a mercantilistic one. And so I think companies because they are not removed from the rest of society. You know, you're part of a local community, of a local church society, and so on. Entrepreneurs have often been invested in the society, or at least in the local community, and I think this is just continuing. So this isn't something radically new. It's just rethinking what it means today and what kind of values are important in that conversation.
Thank you for that very loaded answer, Natalie. Yeah.
Yes, my question is about the evaluation of the model that you're pursuing. I assume that the sessions are mandatory for the workers, or do they self-select? And if they self-select, does that bias a little bit the outcome of the conversations that you have? So that's my first question. The second one is, can you give an example of how it's playing out right now in this Russian-Ukrainian conflict in a workplace in Germany, for example?
Yeah, very good question. The sessions are generally voluntary. So we don't want companies to send us the difficult employees so we can re-educate them. And that would make a really disruptive session in the first place. So we ask people to self-select, but self-select on the basis of how often do you come in touch with disinformation? And do you know what to do about it? How often do you encounter hate speech? And do you feel you're confident and competent to know how to do counter speech? And if people say, yes, I encountered this very often, and we always ask at the beginning of a session or the beginning of a course, how many of you do encounter hate speech or disinformation on a regular basis? It's usually 80, 100%. We then ask people, how many of you know how to do a fact check, how to respond, how to do counter speech? How many of you feel confident? And it's 10, 20%. And that's the gap we're trying to fill. So we don't try to reach the people who are lost, but to reach the huge majority in the middle that is democratically sound, but is confused and disengages. The problem with disinformation is not that people will necessarily believe Russian propaganda, but they no longer believe anything. You know, you might do the best kind of journalism, but it's not going to reach people if people disengage and say, there's so much stuff out there. My Twitter feed is full. My Facebook news feed is full. I'm not going to believe anything anymore because I don't know. So who am I going to follow? My social group, because that's what we do. We are groupish, we're human, and we what the people around us believe. Unless we're contrarian, that's a different story. But most people believe what people around them believe because that's part of social identity. And so we try to reach people who are interested in knowing more about it, but are not necessarily already completely drifting apart into a parallel universe.
Thank you. Any questions from the online community? Give me a second.
A question from journalist and Massey alum Sean McAuliffe. Jan, have you encountered resistance to your work from the very same conspirational far-right swords you're trying to counter? Similar to reporting media, stories on this subject are often called fake news, etc., or elites trying to control the narratives. One notices this on Twitter a lot.
Post latest video explaining disinformation, what it is, we get some comments that are clearly coming from a different perspective, from a different political persuasion. We have now reached directly about 1,300 people in these courses, in over 60 companies. We had a handful of people who asked difficult questions, and at some point we decided that it would be best for them to leave the courses or the trainings because they weren't really interested in engaging with our trainers or with the others in the group. And it just doesn't work when you have 25 people and one person is intentionally disruptive and only has the idea of disrupting this for the sake of being disruptive. And at some point it's best to leave.
Thank you. Aaron?
I just have a quick question.
There's a white mic coming now.
Thanks. I just have a quick question about motivation. To sort of talk or think about democracy in the workplace sounds really nice, but people in the workplace are busy and getting involved in politics takes sort of time and energy. You have to want to do the fact checking and you might be busy and have a million other things on the go. So maybe this is just a question of, again, about is the workplace the appropriate place for this given the demands people have on their time? So how do you address this motivational question within the workplace?
Yeah, good question. And that's the one we often ask ourselves there's two kinds of men. One is the company that has to say, I'm happy for my employees to take 8 hours over the course of 8 weeks for this. And most companies are very, very happy to do it. When we reach out to a company and say, hey, we have this program, then they often say, gosh, this is exactly what I need. We've been having so much disruption with the Russia-Ukraine war. Natalie, with employees from Russia coming in and saying, why is your government Nazis? And people from Ukraine saying, why are you attacking us? And they're bringing in completely different news. We come with this offer that is ready-made and is free. Many companies say, this is what we need. We've been looking for this, but in the civil society arena so well, and don't know who's a reliable actor and who isn't. And so there is often a huge motivation on the part of company owners or diversity, equity, inclusion departments and so on to say this is exactly what we need. And it's a test, it's a pilot. We trial it, 25 people, and then we see where it takes us and to what extent we can include these contents in our own training opportunities further down. And people are motivated mostly because they do encounter hate speech and disinformation all the time, and they don't know what to do about it. They don't want to disengage. They don't want to entirely withdraw from online discussions, but they're so afraid of being confronted with hate speech and malign communication that they really want to know more about what a bot is, how an algorithm works, how they counter more effectively hate speech online.
Thank you, Ian. One last question, Mom?
Do I need the mic or?
Thank you very much, and thank you for that excellent presentation. One quick observation and maybe a quick question. The observation is really that we need to, I'm glad that you've talked about the private sector, because the private sector has often been demonized in a number of contexts. But what we've seen in Canada is that on the issue of DEI, the private sector has actually led the public sector. I speak from experience in the Canadian government and have found this to be so. I think that that's an important point to bear in mind. The question is about research and data that we can rely on. You spoke about how remote working has had an impact on the lack of tolerance, or because we know the diet is pretty critical. We know this intuitively, but I wondered if there was some research that you can point to which would be helpful to us. And maybe one point about, are you interested in working with Canadian organizations? Because you distinctly mentioned if you are working for a German company, and but I would like to know that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I did briefly mention there is a report by the Wolf Institute in Cambridge that looked at the correlation between remote working and tolerance in the workplace. So that's certainly a resource that I could point you to. I need to look up the exact reference, but I'm very happy to send that to you later. And yes, at the moment, unfortunately, we only have aid to work with German companies, also for historical reasons. German foundation to go into the world and tell people how to do it. It's still a minefield, and the Germans here are probably laughing and finding this intuitively funny, and it is a challenge, as you all know. And also, we have called in the Hertie Foundation a difficult Jewish heritage. The Hertie department store was Jewish. It was expropriated in the 1930s. It was taken over by a German man, and he led it to great prosperity in the 1950s and 1960s. And we are still working through that path. Most of the archives were destroyed in the Allied bombing raids, and we don't know to what extent the endowment we sit on now is the result of an expropriation in the 1930s that was illegal. So going to other countries and explaining how democracy works or how people can be better democratic citizens is still difficult. We are still in that pilot phase of doing it in Germany. We want to continue until the end of next year with over 100 companies. There might be then scope for internationalization in different contexts, but unfortunately not yet in Canada. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ian, for that very informative engagement. Thank you, audience in the room and online, for listening to us. We now take a break to go into the next session. Thank you.
Welcome back to the third panel of today's German Canadian Media Symposium. And this panel will be focusing on war propaganda and counter-propaganda in social media. We'll talk about some of the narratives that are being spread on social media and what journalists and newsrooms can do about it. My name's Hannah Hogue. I'm a deputy editor and the Energy and Environment editor at The Conversation, and I'm also a journalism fellow at Massey College. I am going to let our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Sabine, who is joining us from Washington, D.C.
Hi, and thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here, and I wish I could be here in person. The holiday season prevented that. So my name is Sabine Muscat, and I run the program for digital policy and technology at the Heinrich Böll Foundation's Washington, D.C. office. The Heinrich Böll Foundation is a German political foundation. I am a journalist by training. I reported both from the US for German media, and I also reported a lot from Asia in the past, never from Ukraine, but we have Aaron for that. And yeah, so at the Böll Foundation, we run programs. Well, we do have a media fellowship, for example, a transatlantic media fellowship. So we work with journalists. And in the digital policy space that I'm in, we also work a lot on disinformation, social media regulation, and do a lot of that in a transatlantic dialogue between our Berlin, Brussels, and Washington, D.C. offices. Yeah, thanks for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Anatoly?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Anatoly Gruz. I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair at the Toronto Metropolitan University at the Ted Rogers School of Management. Also co-director of the Social Media Lab, where we study how people and organizations use social media, but also how social media changes our practices, communication practices, socializing practices, and things like how people share misinformation and why they share that. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion on this topic.
Thank you very much.
I'm Aaron Wendland. I'm a fellow in public philosophy at King's College London and a senior research fellow here at Massey College in the University of Toronto. I'm a professional academic, but I spend a lot of time doing public philosophy and media work. So I've written for the New York Times, the Toronto Star, the New Statesman, the Moscow Times. I spent some time in Russia. And I recently reporting from Ukraine for the Toronto Star, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and the Wall Street Journal. So Anatoly knows a bit more about the social media side, but I can talk about life on the ground in Ukraine these days.
Thank you very much. So I think we're going to jump right into some of the things that you are individually seeing in your research or from your own reporting. Obviously, us, the public, have seen since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February that we've been hearing a lot more about this information war that Russia is waging on its own people and on the West. And of course, in any war, there's propaganda from all over the place as well. So I'm curious, starting with Sabine, what are you seeing in the US and Europe from your research as far as how is the war being framed and for what purpose? What are the some of the main narratives that you're seeing coming from Russia?
Right. Well, I think with disinformation, look at A, where does it originate, B, who amplifies it, and C, then we have to look at where it resonates and how. And I think in the case of Russia, Ukraine, of course, we're looking a lot at Russian state-sponsored disinformation, Russian state media, but of course that information gets amplified by other groups in other countries who have maybe their own goals. And we've seen that in US elections, especially in 2016. They're also getting amplified by other governments. For example, the Chinese state media have amplified a lot of the Russian narratives. And they're getting amplified by popular influencers in some other countries who may not be connected to maybe Russian actors. I think we all have a few in the US and Canada and in Germany that are very well known and popular and have a big audience. So then we have to look at like what kind of narratives are those? And in the case of Russian disinformation, I mean, there's a global based narrative, I would say. That's usually that Russia has been encircled by NATO, that, the West is all ganging up against Russia. There has been disinformation on the US funding bioweapon labs in Ukraine. All those narratives are out there, and I think they receive different levels of attention, I think, in different countries. And what I thought was very interesting was comparing Canada and Germany. I've looked a little bit of Anatoly, your research that you've done about Canada. And I saw that, for example, there was like, I think 49% of those surveyed believe a version of or part of that story, that the NATO encirclement of Russia story. And that is interesting because I looked at a similar survey in Germany where the overall number of people believing that narrative was lower than in Canada, which I found interesting. Maybe it's closer proximity or knowledge about Russia in general. But the interesting thing in Germany was that East Germans were like twice as likely to believe these than West Germans. And that, of course, does have historic reasons, that East Germany has just been closer to the Soviet Union. And there is also, yeah, you can see that it depends on the what kind of voters you're looking at. And I think in Canada and in the US, you can see that it's mostly right-leaning voters who believe those narratives, whereas in Germany, it could be the far right or the far left that's more likely to believe those narratives than mainstream in the middle center of right or left voters. So that's very interesting for different audiences. And I think then you can take it to other countries as well. And you can see that Russian propaganda works in the Sahel zone in Africa, where the French have retreated, and the Russian-sponsored Wagner militia is trying to fill that gap. And you have people broadcasting Russian messages there as well. And basically with the main narrative of neocolonialism, accusing the West of neocolonialism and Russia as the better actor there. So there's many, many versions that these narratives appear, but they all come with similar roots.
And Anatoly, you looked at how Canadians are being influenced by propaganda. What have you found in your research and your evaluation of the way propaganda is being spread via social media?
Yeah, so being a Canadian research lab, we are interested in how Kremlin spreading misinformation here in this country, what's its prevalence, specifically in the social media space, and to what extent Canadians believed in some of the claims that Sabine mentioned earlier. And so, in fact, we were surprised that nearly half our respondents, we did survey back in May, with Canadians, asking them about their social media use, and as well as whether they were exposed and believed to some extent to some of the common Kremlin's claims, such as that Ukrainian nationalism is a neo-Nazi movement. That another common claim they made. The fact that NATO triggered Russia to be defensive in Ukraine. The fact that West pushed Russia into that war. So things like that. And in fact, half of the Canadians believe to at least one of those claims to some extent. Certainly believe it's a range, so you can believe to some extent or strongly believe. So what we then look at, what are other factors that make you more likely to believe in something like that? And yes, being a far right, politically speaking, puts you in that more kind of believer category. But the other factor that we found very interesting, that if you are consuming news about Ukraine from mainstream media, you're less likely to believe in one of these claims. On the other hand, if you're consuming news from social media or from partisan outlets, you're more likely to believe in those claims. And that opens an interesting opportunity for us to collaboratively discuss some of those ways for us to address disinformation through perhaps promotion of mainstream media, but also what can we do in the space of social media, because our survey shows Canadians and others around the world are more exposed to mis and disinformation operations online.
And Erin, you've been on the ground and reporting from Ukraine this summer. Did you see the impact of some of these social media campaigns at all in the way, people were reacting, or people that you were interviewing, or in other ways?
I mean, I guess what I learned from my time on the ground and listening to people talk on the panel today is that information in some way is a tool or a weapon of warfare. And this is sort of obvious on the ground. We're having a public panel today, and there are things I can't talk about because having a public panel. And so there's this fog of war is real. The Ukrainian army institutes a media blackout for very good reasons. We don't want intelligence to get out to the Russians or other actors, the Wagner group, for example. And so there is this media blackout, and this means there's necessarily a gap in what happens on the ground and what appears in the international headlines. And I can maybe give a quick sort of example of this, which connects it to social media, is that when I was in Eastern Ukraine, this is early in the summer, so the Russians are actually making progress. They're pushing into Ukraine. And the Wagner group posted seemingly celebratory video to Telegram. And Ukrainian and American intelligence picked up on this. And as far as I can tell, I can't verify this because I can't get behind the Russian front line, but this position was attacked by the Ukrainians because the Russians decided to celebrate on social media. So this shows the importance of having a sort of blackout on the front line and the power that media sort of has to inform things, but also potentially keep things quiet in my case, to help the Ukrainians prosecute their war effort. We're not reporting and talking about particular things precisely so the Ukrainian army can succeed. And potentially maybe on this idea of information as sort of a weapon or tool of war, and sticking with the theme of sort of social media, I think Zelensky really realizes or understands this. So he is the president of Ukraine. He's in charge of the army, but he's himself is not a professional soldier. So he leaves it to his general allies to fight the war. But he himself is fighting the war in parliaments around the world by giving compelling speeches and putting out videos and winning the hearts and minds of people around the world. So he also, again, understands that information is a weapon or tool of war, and he's trying to use it to his advantage to defeat the Russians in his.
Thank you. I'm also curious, Sabine or Anatoly, are you seeing links in your research between particular political events, say such as meetings of leaders or when deals are signed, with an increase in disinformation that's being spread on social media?
I can go first.
Yes, please.
So we haven't, in our work, looking at social media data specifically, we see trends of spikes in terms of mis and disinformation often coincide with major attacks in Ukraine. And so that's when Russia trying to apply the common strategies of denying what the actually atrocities they've done. Then they can no longer deny it, they diminish it. And then finally, or put blame on somebody else. And finally, they distract. So they put some others, something in front of us to talk about here in the media. So a couple examples comes to mind when horrible pictures from Bucha emerged, what Russia did and torturing people. So what Kremlin said, it's not us, it's staged. If you remember, it was back in April. It's staged, it's Western countries just put crisis actors there. And the other example was later in the summer when they hit a shopping center in central Ukraine, Crimea, and killing civilians. Well, Kremlin said, first they said it's not us. And then they said, well, it was us, but it was actually the shopping center was empty. And then they said it was used by military personnel there. And so we see that happen again and again. And then they throw things like last week, Russian embassy in Ottawa tweeted a picture of LGBT rainbow flag crossed out like a stop sign and saying that, family values, I'm paraphrasing, it's between men, women, and children. Families, men, women, children. And so those are not related to war in Ukraine, but they distracting us. They tap into that far-right ideology to distract, to find support. And so in our work, we don't see a lot happening in the online space around major international events. It's more around events on the ground or those distraction campaigns done by official accounts, social media accounts from the Kremlin.
How about you, Sabine? Are you finding links between political events, things that are happening internationally, and social media spikes in disinformation?
Well, I'm not a researcher like Anatoly on this. I'm a program director, but I can see what maybe I just wanted to, I would agree with Anatoly, of course, like major Bucha trigger a new flood of disinformation and opposing narratives. But I think what I want to add to this is that in many ways, like coming back to audiences maybe outside Ukraine and how they respond to that. I think it's not so much that people believe those Russian narratives about what actually happened on the ground, but the goal of it is often to just sow confusion. And I think for journalists, that's the hardest part, to like fall into this trap of whataboutism, you know, because you're always trained to report both sides of the story. And so in this case, it's a very you cannot not react to that, because those narratives are out there. So I think you have to pick them up and you have to refute them. Facts, you know, you have to basically find the facts that show this image was wrong, this didn't happen the way this was, which is of course very hard in a war situation. But pointing that out and maybe presenting the Russian perspective, but also taking a clear stance on why this is wrong or this is fake news is really the challenge for journalists, media organizations, but also for the platforms that monitor the content.
So you bring me to what I think is a very important sort of aspect of this conversation. That's what is the responsibility of the social media platforms to remove disinformation and propaganda? I think one of the things we've seen with Twitter in particular is that there are now tags that say, you know, on RT, for example, RT's Twitter handle, it says this is a Russia state-affiliated media there. But I have to say, I didn't see it the first time. It's small, it's grayed out. There's one that is similar on the Ukrainian handle as well. And I don't think a lot of the public sees this or really understands what it means. Do you think that these labels have any effect on the public's understanding that something might be disinformation or propaganda? Or is there more that social media should be doing? And I'll start with you, Anatoly.
Mm-hmm. Labeling of online content is one tool that social media platforms can apply to inform public whether a source is credible or not. And early days of social media, the blue check mark, whether it's on Twitter's account or Facebook accounts, was often associated with credible source. It's either elected official or journalists like you are in the room here. Later, with Musk's Twitter, we see a shift from using labels to actually convey the signal that is credible source, authentic, to using it for money-making opportunities. So now you can pay $8 to have your blue check mark on Twitter. And it doesn't mean that you authorize a source to speak on some of the matters. The labeling you brought up is another good example. It's another initiative to don't just give binary assignment, credible, non-credible, with a blue check mark, but differentiate whether a source is a government-sponsored, government-controlled media or the department. Well, that's also misleading and confusing. On Twitter, you can turn your account to professional account, and you can actually choose self-identify yourself, what profession you're in, and it will appear in the same section where you would normally see state-sponsored. So labeling can also lead to confusion if it's not done right or consistent, and that's unfortunately what we're seeing right now.
How about you, Sabine? Do you have any thoughts on what social media platforms could be doing to help, I guess, dissipate some of this confusion that the public or journalists might be facing when reading information online?
I do, and I hear you about the labels, even though I do think that people have noticed them. I mean, it was a shift, right? I think there are some other things that social media have been doing that I find very valuable. One is to create some researchers have called it to create friction, because everything very fast on social media and you hit share before you've even read the story. And so there are now often prompts that tell you, do you want to read this first before you share it, you know? And I think in a lot of cases, it's really about amplification. It's always a balance between content moderation is always a very fine balance between freedom of speech and countering disinformation. It's very hard, and different countries also have different laws and different rules for that. In the US, the bar is very high with the First Amendment to do anything that could be seen as a censorship. But platforms can, of course, they use algorithms, right, to promote content. And this is where the main issue is. And this is, for example, where the European Union targets that particular aspect with its Digital Services Act and Code of Practice for Disinformation, because this is where you have to hold the platforms more accountable to how do they tweak their algorithms to promote certain things. For example, just before this panel, I actually Googled one of those very well-known German Russian influencers, a young woman who promotes a lot of like Russian propaganda online. And when I did a German Google search, I found all the reports on how she's spreading disinformation, how the German authorities have started investigating her and all that stuff. When I did an Google search, interestingly, the top 5 results that I got were disinformation and fake news, basically portraying her as a victim and saying this young woman is being criminalized by Germany, but just for showing Ukrainian atrocities that have all been debunked, by the way, those atrocities that she allegedly. So it's interesting how, for example, the Google algorithm, at least for the US, did not promoted the disinformation or the fake news over the other news that came further down. That put her story in perspective, and that was by mainstream, more respectable news sources like the Washington Post. So this is a real problem.
I think it's a really interesting point that sometimes we forget that based geographically where we're based, we might be getting different information, and it's purely based on an IP address and that geolocator. People are seeing different information and will confront sort of truths and beliefs from that. Aaron, on the ground, when you're reporting in a war situation, how are you trying to sort of I guess correlate what you're seeing, what you're reporting, what you're hearing from other sources, and what you may be either seeing yourself from social media, keeping in mind that geolocation aspect, or from others that are feeding you social media from, the US or Europe?
Difficult. I think the answer from earlier panels is you just have to be sort of skeptical about almost everything. The first reaction is, okay, I've read this is coming out. Who can I talk to verify this? Do I know somebody in Kyiv? Have a connection with the government there? Do I have a connection with the army that I can talk to about this? Of course, the thing is, this is, again, the way that this tool of warfare is, Anatoly was talking about how after some event occurs, the Russians flood. And the idea is you have so much material that how can you check which one of these things could I even verify? A lot of them you can easily dismiss because you spend a lot of time, you sort of immerse yourself in this world, and by immersing yourself in this world, it's easier for you to make quick identifications. Okay, this is propaganda. This is something close to a real source. Let me follow up on that. So in some ways, just experience helps in knowing who to talk to on the ground. Having the right phone numbers of the right people in Kyiv or in other places makes a big difference. So this is how you try to address it. But of course, you can't respond to all of it. And sometimes you just have to accept that, okay, I'm just going to this on faith because I'm one person and I can talk to my network of people and I can talk to my newsroom back home. But yeah.
Maybe just to follow up on the idea you mentioned about being immersed in that information environment is quite important to be able to quickly pick up and differentiate whether it's disinformation or potential misleading claim or not. And so from that perspective, a lot of Ukrainians, and I'm originally from Ukraine, I still have family there, so I follow all of the same sources that Ukrainians on the ground would use, Telegram channels, YouTube, Twitter, what have you. And so once you do that, you immerse in that information environment, you quickly picking up the same news being reported from what perspective, on what channel. And I do it in 3 languages, Ukrainian, English, and Russian. So you can also see that play a bit of role. And same, Ukrainians do the same. Often they, bilinguals looking at Ukrainian and Russian speaking content. And they've been trained to observe the Kremlin's propaganda since 2014. It's 2022 here, we're talking about information and Kremlin's narrative only now, but Ukraine's been living for years under that information warfare. So the citizens, they're a bit more cautious and more aware of type of strategies Kremlin might be using and imposing. Plus, over the last 8 years, what we saw essentially the kind of divorce between cultural, political, as well as social media related divorce between Ukraine and Russia, where 2014 Ukraine was quite vulnerable, where all of the Ukrainians would be in the same platforms like Vkontakte, Odnoklassniki. Those are social networking websites that were Russian based, but were popular in Ukraine because you have friends and families in Russia as well. And so that makes them more vulnerable and Ukrainian institution more to Kremlin's disinformation. But 2022, that's not anymore the case. Plus, a lot of Western social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, now YouTube blocked in Russia. So you have that separate information landscape conflicted. So what's this long point is I'm making that in Canada and other Western countries are more vulnerable to disinformation because we're not immersed in that particular environment day to day.
Maybe just following up is that you need to find people on the ground who you can trust. And in the case of Ukraine, right, they've been fighting this since 2014. So there have been people, Ukrainian journalists, who've been reporting on this for a while. So the person I primarily worked with there, she's from Donetsk. She was one of the first journalists on the ground after the MH17 bombing. She has a track record of working with the Ukrainian army, working with government officials, publishing these kinds of things. And so you can trust the information that's she's giving you because she has experience and a track record of doing this kind of work. So that's really important, finding people on the ground.
One of the things that I did want to bring up was sort of this counter-propaganda as well. And we've seen some very creative approaches, I think, to counter-propaganda online, on Twitter in particular. What are some of the things that have really stood out to you as far as being quite effective? And I'll start with Anatoly.
So let's think about how we define effectiveness. What was interesting, from 2014, and we start looking at the information warfare in Ukraine since Euromaidan revolution in Kiev, or revolution of dignity. So what's different now was kind of preempting some of the Russian strategies or some of the Russian claims ahead of time. Because, those who've been in that field and been exposed to Kremlin's propaganda, it's very similar strategies, similar, deny, deflect, distract type of strategies. And you can kind of anticipate when they will start their propaganda machine. And so as a result, you can see more often than not since the start of this full-scale invasion, where you have sources or American sources or others kind of preemptively saying, well, Russia will be claiming such and such, don't believe it. So I think that was one of the effective ways to combat the potential claims.
All right. And Sabine, are you seeing interesting things with the counter-propaganda on social media as well in your research?
Counter-propaganda, I think that's more a question really for Anatoly and Aaron in terms of what the Ukrainian government is doing, or what the Ukrainians are doing there. I've been looking into, it's actually a question that I would have for Anatoly especially, would be to see how efforts by other Western countries like the US with Radio Free Europe, and like what their international broadcasting efforts, because those are like traditionally, historically, to put the US perspective out there, or in Germany it's Deutsche Welle or whatnot. How much do these organizations still reach audiences, and how relevant is that actually to audiences in Ukraine who may have much better access to information through their own sources on the ground? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, from my personal experience, that those sources are less relevant nowadays. Most of the Ukrainians glued to their Telegram accounts and groups, so meaning they're not exposed to professional journalistic practices. So that's a problem. Of course, given that most Ukrainians are technologically savvy and they kind of trying to figure out themselves what sources to trust or not. But yeah, so I think what would be the biggest impact of Western efforts is the physical internet infrastructure, Starlink, things like that. Because when Russia occupies certain areas, they disconnect the internet. They only, push their own information. And once you're in the Russian sphere of influence, the news have 24/7 RT news or other news there. So you're starting to live in a bubble. So I think making sure that there's a physical infrastructure for Ukrainians to still have access to those other resources, that is quite important.
I think we will move to questions from the audience, starting with anyone who's in the room with us now, and after that we'll move to any online questions.
Hi, thank you very much. This is a really cool panel. The question I have is kind of from something that Aaron said, which is looking at like meetouts in conflict areas. it's very clear that certain pieces of information, if shared, negatively affect a particular agenda, and if withheld, positively affect that particular agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not really a matter of misinformation, it's a matter of like determining what to share and what to not share.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it seems reasonable to respect these sort of media blackouts, but only insofar as you've already decided from the outset, like which side you want to be supported and which side you want to be harmed by the sharing or withholding of the information. And so it seems like, you know, there's already a moral judgment that's being made on the part of the journalist before the choice to share the fact is made. So maybe could you speak to how that kind of assessment goes?
So, I mean, in some ways, it's not an assessment that you get to make. It's sort of you sign on the dotted line before you have the opportunity to go to the front line with the Ukrainian army. They will tell you explicitly, we can allow you to do this, this, and this. You want to go on a demining exercise? We can take you there. You want to go to the front line? We can do there. You want to go on a night patrol in Kharkiv or Mykolaiv? You can do these things on the condition that you don't report about them. And I think part of the idea behind this is it gives you a sense of what this war is really about. You get firsthand sort of experience. I guess personally, I can't speak for every journalist who has done this, but to your point about picking sides or this kind of stuff, even if you're there and you're like, I'm trying to have a quote unquote objective account of this, when you're working with the Ukrainian army, you kind of feel like, I'm one of them, right? Like I'm kind of fighting this war with them. I'm literally in the trench here and they're shelling the Russians 10 kilometers away. It's hard not to feel part of this effort in some way. So I don't know if this is, you're right, that if information is part of, one of the things I'm thinking about in this context is the, early on in the war, the Ukrainian army was criticized for not releasing much information about casualties on their side. And there was lots of talk about Russian casualties. And this seemed to be a strategy to keep morale up within Ukraine and also within the international community. And so it was a deliberate decision about what information to and to not share by the Ukrainian army. And they were doing this because they thought this is going to be effective in our fight against Russia here. So again, I guess this circles back to my original, that even for the army, information is a tool of war, and they're trying to use it as best they can. And so presumably the Russians are too. We're just not on the Russian side, right? They kicked the CBC out a long time ago.
We have a question online, I believe.
Yeah, we have a question from Paul Müller. Since many people are in their own social media bubbles that are often based on algorithms, reading and repeating their preferred sources of information, how can you break people out of their bubbles if they are, for example, in these kind of far-right pro-Russian echo chambers and reach them on social media with facts other than the propaganda they're consuming?
Do you want to take that?
Start.
Yeah.
It reminds me the same question came up when we talk about anti-vaccine misinformation. Like, how do you talk to anti-vaxxers to convince them about, effectiveness of vaccines and safety record? Well, you can't. And so I think nowadays in my community, misinformation researchers believe that you work with some people who are willing to listen to you. It reminded me previous presentation where you don't spend 100% of your time on 5% who you're less likely to convince. You spend on the people who are in the middle. So I think maybe just let's stop this illusion of trying to convince somebody who is already in echo chamber, Russian, pro-Kremlin. But maybe looking at working with platforms to make sure their messages are not amplified by recommender, what Sabina was talking about, recommender systems. And that will happen with vaccine-related misinformation, where platforms like YouTube, we've been studying their use of recommender system. They finally slow down amplification of anti-vaccine messages. And the other thing, work with platforms to demonetize some of those misinformation topics, because not everybody there to support the Kremlin, but they're there to support their wallets sometimes.
Sabine, do you have a response for that?
Well, but can only agree. Like you're not going to reach the people who are already gone so far to that site, but you're going to try to reach the people who are doubtful, the people who may not believe one or the other narrative, but who are just confused and overwhelmed by conflicting information they're getting. And yes, you cannot do that. You can do that with responsible journalism. Also, going back to what Aaron said, you can always be transparent about the circumstances of your reporting. You can always mention that you were embedded with the Ukrainian army, right? But you don't write about certain things that you see when you're with them, of course, due to non-disclosure agreements. But also, like the New York Times has been doing that lately, and I think that's a very good method. They put these little info boxes inside the texts where they say, this is how we use anonymous sources, right? These are our internal rules for that. We know the identity of the person, and we have one other editor who knows it, and we can't reveal the source because to protect this person. But they're very transparent about their journalistic methods. I think that's a way to deal with these things. But lastly, I mean, at the end of the day, there's also things that are outside of the hands of journalists and educated public. We do need policymakers, and we do need platforms. We need policymakers to hold platforms accountable, and we need the platforms to be more transparent about their algorithms and how those work.
To thank our panelists, both in person and online, for that really insightful discussion, and for our audience, both here and online as well, for joining us. And with that, I'll pass the floor to Desrosiers.
Well, first of all, let me thank you and thank all of the panelists for an excellent discussion. I think we had such a good time in getting lots of issues were addressed today. So my role is to try to present briefly lessons learned or a little bit of a summary. Didn't have much time to ingurgitate it all, so I'm just going to go in simply first say the first panel for me was very interesting in highlighting four aspects. Number one, the importance of locals in managing the flow of information and testing what is a normal system that should be. What was interesting particularly was not just certainly the local persons, but also managing the local professional journalist and the importance of a local professionalism in there. And I think we heard that very much from Zual in supporting the local journalist. I was quite interested in the way in which we, the idea was always be aware that there's an agenda out there and people have agendas and how to manage and be skeptical to this. I thought it was also interesting to move a little bit on the role of the media outlets more generally, dividing the work, supporting their reporters, but you don't have to do it all because you're overwhelmed in the field. So the idea that media outlets have a larger responsibility to organize themselves in a way that will both support their reporting, but also ensure that they are able to test the agendas. And finally, we talked a little bit about the responsibility of the public, which very nicely to the second panel about the way in which war propaganda, disinformation affects the workplace, and the way in which this interesting experiment is being portrayed about how you teach civil and digital citizenry in the workplace. I think there's lots to be learned about that methodology and the interest that we all have, knowing that it will affect the way in which workplace works, the way in which people relate to each other. I think we're all very worried about remote working now in terms of how it diminishes tolerance or the ability for people to exchange. And finally, I think in our last panel, great research that is being done about how we understand how people are, who are the influencers, how indeed the issues are being amplified and who responds to that amplification. I thought the panel kind of illustrated very well the responsibility of platform, the responsibility eventually of the public sphere, that is politicians or the public policy, to respond, to impose more transparency on algorithms that are necessary. But also I think we've referred back to the idea that the role of all of us is certainly to be more critical of what we read and to continue support the idea of good media. I was struck in the last panel with the fact that people were more likely to be in their echo chambers and more susceptible to be influenced and believe the disinformation if indeed they were getting their information solely for social media as opposed to the mainstream. So it reinforces the message that we all know, that the scene of the media, the health of the media is indeed important, not only for good information, but also the strength of democracy, the strength probably of productivity in the workplace, but also ultimately the truth. Thank you very much. You're all invited upstairs.